They say the darkest stories are the ones never written down, the ones whispered behind closed doors, locked inside family walls where truth rots like a body left unburied. This is not a tale of fiction, not the kind of horror someone invents for a book or a film. This is America's horror, a story buried under generations of silence, so grotesque that most would rather pretend it never existed, but it did, and tonight we open the door to it. Picture a man who held absolute power over his family, a man who blurred the line between father and husband, protector and predator, a man who looked into the eyes of his own daughter and saw not his child, but his bride. This was not just abuse, not just violence. This was a dynasty built on violation, a family tree that twisted into itself until the branches strangled the very roots that gave it life. The soil of rural America is rich with stories of hidden families, cut off from the world, left to create their own rules. Isolation breeds secrets, and secrets breed monsters. In these forgotten hollows, where outsiders rarely came and the law rarely reached, one man became more than a father. He became a patriarch, a king of a kingdom so small it fit within four walls, yet so consuming it devoured the souls of everyone trapped inside. The truth of what he did, and how long it continued, has been pieced together through fragments. Court documents, faded testimonies, rumors passed down like curses in small-town whispers. Few dare to speak his name now, fewer still admit what they know. But every atrocity leaves scars, and the scars of this family were carved deep into the American landscape. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it. The silence of daughters who were told to obey, the silence of sons who knew but never spoke, the silence of neighbors who saw shadows in the window and decided to look away. This silence is the true accomplice. And it is within that silence that the most inbred patriarch in America forged his legacy. Tonight, we are going to break that silence. But once you step into this story, you may never leave it the same. To understand how such a nightmare could unfold, we have to go back to the beginning, to the soil where it was planted. The man who would one day become a monster was not born into power, he was born into poverty. A boy raised in the shadows of rural America, where hunger gnawed louder than morality and survival demanded silence. From his earliest days, he learned two truths, that isolation meant freedom and that control meant safety. Those around him described him as stern, brooding, a man who commanded without needing to raise his voice. He grew up in a place where family ties were not just bonds but chains. Neighbors were scarce. The outside world was a rumor, something glimpsed only on the rare trips into town. In that isolation, boundaries blurred. What was forbidden elsewhere could be rationalized here, and within that silence, his hunger grew. When he became a father, he wasn't interested in raising children, he was interested in raising possession. Every daughter was a reflection of himself, a creation he believed he owned entirely. He twisted scripture to justify it, twisting words of faith into a weapon of domination. Where others saw sin, he saw destiny. Where others saw family, he saw blood he could bend to his will. The house itself became a fortress of secrecy. Its walls held screams that never escaped, and the windows became watchful eyes that kept the outside world away. He cut his children off from friends, from schooling, from anything that might plant a seed of rebellion. Isolation became his most powerful tool. In his world, there were no outsiders to tell the daughters that their father's touch was not love. No one to tell them that a wedding veil does not belong to a child. And when the time came, he crossed the line completely. He took his daughter not as a child, but as his wife. He presented it as fate, as if the family tree was meant to curve back into itself. She was young, terrified, and powerless, but to him she was no longer his child. She was the proof that his kingdom belonged entirely to him. This was not just an act of lust, it was an act of control, of legacy. By taking his daughter, he ensured that his bloodline, his will, his corruption would echo through every child that followed, and with each passing year, the roots of his empire grew darker, twisting deeper into the soil of his family's shame. What happens to a child when her father becomes her husband? The answer is not simply pain. It is a kind of fracture that splits the soul in two. On the outside, she became what he demanded, obedient, silent, the dutiful wife in a grotesque imitation of normalcy. But inside, she carried a scream that could never be voiced. She carried the knowledge that her innocence was stolen not by a stranger, but by the man who should have protected it most. The community around them knew fragments, but fragments are easy to dismiss. A girl too young wearing the weary face of an old soul. A family too secretive, too withdrawn. Whispers swirled, yet whispers never became action. In towns like these, people look the other way. As long as the house kept its doors shut, as long as no one ran into the street begging for help, the silence held. And the silence is where monsters thrive. Children were born into this silence. Some carried his features, unmistakably so. Each child was both victim and evidence, living proof of what the patriarch had done. Yet in his eyes, they were trophies, symbols that his control was absolute. They grew up in a world where siblings were also nieces, where mothers were also sisters, where the family tree was not a tree at all, but a knot, tangled and choking itself. And the deeper the knot grew, the harder it became to untangle. For the daughters, escape was nearly impossible. Where could they run? Who would believe them? In that time and place, a young girl claiming her father had become her husband was not just scandalous, it was unthinkable. And so they stayed. They bore his children. They watched as their brothers, raised in the same warped kingdom, were taught to follow his example, to see women not as daughters or sisters, but as property. Generation by generation, the curse deepened. What began as one man's violation became a cycle, a prison, with invisible walls. And through it all, the patriarch sat at the center, watching his dynasty grow from the shadows, convinced that what he had built was not a crime, but a legacy. It is here we must pause to ask, how much of this horror belonged to one man alone, and how much belonged to the silence that allowed him to reign? The longer his reign continued, the more his power became myth within the family. He was not just a father, not just a husband. He became something larger than life, an almost godlike figure in the eyes of those he controlled. Fear does that. When you strip people of choices, when you make escape impossible, they begin to believe the prison itself is destiny. For the daughters, submission was survival. To resist meant punishment. To obey meant a small chance of safety, even if safety was an illusion. For the sons, indoctrination ran deep. They were raised not to question, but to emulate. They saw their father's behavior not as horror, but as inheritance. And so the sickness seeped from one generation to the next, poisoning the very blood that carried it forward. Outside the walls of that house, life went on. Neighbors nodded politely, townsfolk exchanged casual greetings, yet suspicion hung in the air like smoke no one wanted to acknowledge. Some claimed they noticed the strange looks between father and daughter, the unsettling closeness. Others whispered about children who looked too much like him to be mistaken, but whispers never became action. Fear of scandal, fear of confrontation, fear of tearing open the rotten underbelly of their own community. It all kept the silence intact. And the patriarch knew it. He thrived on it. He understood that shame was his greatest ally. No one wanted to admit what was happening, not even his victims, because to speak it aloud would make it real. So he sat like a spider at the center of his web, confident that as long as no one pulled at the threads, his secret would remain safe. But secrets have weight, and the weight of this one pressed harder with each passing year. Children grew older, more were born. The family tree bent further inward, its branches twisting into grotesque shapes. And though the house seemed silent to tea, He whirled outside. Inside it rang with a quiet madness, a madness where love was replaced with ownership, where loyalty was bred from fear, and where blood was used to bind chains tighter than any iron could. It is said that every empire eventually collapses, but when an empire is built on silence, its collapse is never sudden. It seeps out, slow and inevitable, like rot creeping through wood. Eventually, silence can no longer contain the truth. For this family, the cracks began to show in whispers that grew louder, in children who carried the weight of their father and grandfather's sins etched into their very faces. Neighbors who once turned away began to murmur that something was wrong. Authorities who once ignored the shadows began, reluctantly, to look inside. And when they did, they uncovered a horror so tangled it defied comprehension. Reports described generations of inbreeding, lines so crossed that family roles became meaningless. What was a daughter, a sister, a niece? When the bloodline folded back on itself, those words lost all clarity. Investigators spoke of children who struggled to speak, who bore deformities, who carried the genetic scars of their father's obsession. The evidence was undeniable. The patriarch had not just destroyed his children's innocence, he had corrupted their very blood. And yet, even as the truth surfaced, many still could not face it. The idea that a man could take his own daughter as wife, that he could father children with her and repeat the cycle again and again, it was too much for most to accept. Easier to dismiss it as rumor, easier to let the silence swallow it back down. Because once a community admits such evil happened in their midst, they must also admit they let it happen. But the scars remained, whether acknowledged or not. They remained in the children who grew up not knowing who they truly were. They remained in the mothers who bore children they never wanted. They remained in the twisted bloodline, passed forward like a curse, impossible to erase. And they remain, still, in the haunted stories that echo through those rural hollows of America. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you run, woo, will you speak, or would silence claim you too? Because in the end, the most terrifying part of this story is not the patriarch himself. It's how many people knew, how many people saw, and how many chose to look away. For the descendants of this man, escape was not as simple as walking away. Blood follows you. It stains every relationship, every glance in the mirror. Imagine growing up and realizing that your father is also your grandfather, that your mother is also your sister. Imagine the crushing weight of knowing that your very existence is proof of a crime, that you were born not out of love, but out of domination. Some tried to flee. They drifted into nearby towns, hoping to blend in, hoping no one would ask questions about their past. But whispers have a way of traveling. Neighbors would look too closely at their faces, noticing features that told a story too dark to be spoken aloud. For many, there was no escape. Their identity was their prison. Those who stayed behind were swallowed by the cycle. Sons grew into men who had only one example of fatherhood to follow: control, possession, abuse. Daughters grew into women who carried both the trauma of being victims and the looming terror of becoming prey again, and so the wheel turned, grinding their humanity into dust, feeding a legacy of silence and shame. Psychologists who have studied families like this speak of generational trauma, of cycles of abuse passed down like heirlooms. But even the cold language of psychology struggles to capture the horror of what this patriarch built. This was more than trauma. It was a kingdom of blood where the ruler's desire infected everyone beneath him, leaving no life untouched. And yet, he remained untouchable, protected not by strength alone, but by the cowardice of those who refused to act. The community around him carried his secret like a burden they wanted to forget. Officials looked the other way, afraid of the scandal. Even relatives beyond the immediate circle stayed silent, terrified of the shame that would stain their names. And so the patriarch aged, watching the family tree collapse inward, watching his legacy rot, yet never once facing the justice he deserved. Every horror has an ending, but endings do not always bring peace. The patriarch eventually died, leaving behind not a family but a scar. His death was not justice. There was no trial that could measure the weight of what he had done. There was only the quiet settling of dust, the whisper of a name that people refused to speak aloud, and the children, now adults, left to carry the unbearable inheritance of his sins. For those descendants, life became an act of survival. Some tried to untangle themselves from the curse, to start fresh lives far from the soil where it all began. But blood cannot be rewritten. Every new generation carried traces of the past in their DNA, in their memories, in the silence that still clung to them like a shadow. Others remained trapped, bound to the same land, repeating the same patterns, too broken to escape. The story of this patriarch is not just a story of incest, inbreeding, or abuse. It is a story about silence. The silence of daughters too afraid to speak. The silence of neighbors too ashamed to act. The silence of a nation that prefers its myths clean and its history untainted. But history is never clean. It is stained with blood, with secrets, with horrors that are easier to deny than to confront. And so we confront it here. We remember it not to sensationalize, not to gawk at the grotesque, but to remind ourselves of what silence allows. When we refuse to see, when we choose not to speak, we become accomplices. The patriarch may have built his dynasty of shame, but it was the silence that kept it standing. If you have listened this far, you have walked through the darkest corridors of American family history, and perhaps now you understand why so many people prefer to look away. But history does not vanish because we ignore it. It waits in the shadows, in the whispers, in the bloodlines that still walk among us. He too took his own daughter as his wife, and in doing so he built one of the most twisted legacies this country has ever known. His story is not folklore, it is not myth, it is the truth of what can happen when a man's hunger goes unchecked, and when silence reigns louder than justice. And it is a truth America can never fully bury.